A village of 200 people vanished overnight in 1974, leaving behind empty homes and abandoned lives. Authorities declared it a mass evacuation due to an approaching chemical spill from a nearby factory. But 50 years later, investigative journalist Sarah Mitchell discovers a hidden bunker beneath the town that reveals a truth so horrifying, it rewrites everything we thought we knew about human experimentation and government cover-ups. The autumn. Mist hung low over the remnants of Millbrook Valley, Pennsylvania, as Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her rental car onto what had once been Main Street. Weeds pushed through cracked asphalt, and the skeletal remains of storefronts stood like broken teeth against the gray October sky. This place had been calling to her for months, ever since she'd stumbled across a single paragraph buried in a 1974 newspaper archive while researching an entirely different story about industrial accidents in rural America. Sarah was 34 years old, a seasoned investigative journalist who had built her reputation on uncovering stories that others either couldn't or wouldn't touch. Her work for the Washington Tribune had earned her 3 Polk Awards and a reputation for meticulous research that had toppled corrupt politicians and exposed corporate malfeasance. She had the kind of dogged persistence that made sources nervous and editors grateful, a combination of intellectual curiosity and moral outrage that drove her to spend weeks in musty archives and months building trust with reluctant witnesses. The story that had brought her to this abandoned place began with a footnote in a Department of Environmental Protection report about chemical contamination in southwestern Pennsylvania. The report mentioned the emergency evacuation of Millbrook Valley due to industrial spillage from Hastings Chemical Works, October 15, 1974. It was a single line among hundreds of pages of dry regulatory language, but something about it had nagged at Sarah. In her 15 years of journalism, she had learned to trust those nagging feelings. Her initial research had revealed the basic facts quickly enough. Millbrook Valley had been a small farming community nestled in a narrow valley between 2 ridges of the Appalachian foothills. Population 203, according to the 1970 census, though locals insisted the number was closer to 200 by 1974. The town had grown up around a crossroads where 2 county highways met, supporting itself through dairy farming, a small lumber mill, and the paychecks that some residents earned at the Hastings Chemical Works facility 15 miles to the north. According to the official record, on the evening of October 14, 1974, a storage tank at the chemical plant had ruptured, releasing thousands of gallons of industrial solvent into Beaver Creek, which flowed directly through the heart of Millbrook Valley. State authorities, working with federal environmental officials, had made the decision to evacuate the entire population as a precautionary measure. The evacuation had proceeded smoothly through the night, with residents relocating to emergency shelters in nearby counties while cleanup crews worked to contain the spill. The cleanup had taken longer than expected. Weeks turned into months as environmental teams struggled with the contamination. By the time the all-clear was given in spring of 1975, most of the displaced residents had established new lives elsewhere. A few families had attempted to return, but with the local economy destroyed and the stigma of contamination hanging over the valley, even they had eventually moved on. The town had died not with violence, but with a whimper of bureaucracy and environmental caution. It was a sad story, certainly, but hardly unique in the industrial landscape of 1970s America. Small communities had been wiped off the map by everything from highway construction to mining disasters to corporate relocations. What made Sarah pause was not the evacuation itself, but the complete absence of follow-up coverage. She had found the initial reports in the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review and the Uniontown Herald-Standard, brief articles noting the evacuation and the environmental concerns, but then nothing. No follow-up stories about the cleanup, no human interest pieces about families displaced by the disaster, no investigative reporting about the chemical company's safety practices. In an era when environmental consciousness was rising and industrial accidents were front-page news, the complete disappearance of an entire town should have generated more coverage. The timing was particularly puzzling, coming just months after the highly publicized chemical contamination in Times Beach, Missouri, which had made national headlines and sparked congressional hearings. Yet Millbrook Valley had seemingly vanished from public consciousness as completely as it had vanished from the map. Sarah's curiosity had deepened when she tried to locate former residents. She had started with the most recent phone directories from surrounding counties, looking for family names that appeared in the 1970 Millbrook Valley census. The Kowalskis, the O'Briens, the Hendersons, the Garcias, families that had lived in the valley for generations, according to local records. She found a few scattered references, obituaries mostly, but nothing that led to living relatives willing to talk about their experience. The most promising lead had come from Rose Henderson, whose grandfather had owned the lumber mill that employed nearly 30 people in 1974. Rose lived in a nursing home in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, about an hour's drive from where Millbrook Valley had once stood. When Sarah called to request an interview, the woman had gone silent for nearly a minute before speaking in a voice thick with old fear. "You shouldn't be asking about that place," Rose had whispered into the phone. "Nothing good comes from stirring up that business. My grandfather told us never to speak of it, and we never did. Some things are better left buried." Rose had refused to meet in person, but she had given Sarah one crucial piece of information before hanging up. "If you're fool enough to go looking around that valley, you check the old Henderson property. Grandpa always said there were things under that land that didn't belong to God or man." The Henderson property, according to county records, had encompassed nearly 40 acres on the eastern side of the valley, including the lumber mill and the family's farmhouse. Sarah had driven past it twice already today, noting the foundation stones that marked where buildings had once stood and the concrete pad that had supported some kind of heavy machinery. But Rose's cryptic warning about things under that land had stuck with her. As Sarah walked through what had been the town center, she tried to imagine the place as it had been 50 years ago. Main Street would have bustled with the daily commerce of a small farming community. The Kowalski family had run a general store in the building, whose brick walls still partially stood near the intersection. The O'Briens had operated a diner that, according to a 1973 business directory, had served the best apple pie in 3 counties. The Garcia family had owned the town's only gas station, a full-service operation that had also sold fishing licenses and hunting supplies. These had been real people with real lives, not statistics in a government report. They had owned dogs, and planted gardens and argued about politics, and worried about their children's futures. The idea that all of them had simply accepted an overnight evacuation and then disappeared forever into the broader American landscape strained credibility. Even if the environmental threat had been real, some of them should have fought to return, should have demanded compensation, should have sued the chemical company or the government or someone. Sarah pulled out her digital camera and began documenting what remained. The concrete foundations were overgrown with ivy and small trees that had taken root in the cracks. Pieces of rusted metal, parts of vehicles, farming equipment, household appliances, lay scattered among the weeds like archaeological artifacts. She photographed everything, methodically working her way through the ghost town with the thoroughness that had made her reputation. Near what had been the post office, she found something that made her stop. Carved into a concrete foundation stone, barely visible beneath 50 years of weathering, were words that looked like they had been etched with a knife or screwdriver. "They came at night. Tell the world. J.K." Sarah knelt beside the stone, brushing away moss and dirt to read the inscription more clearly. J.K. could have been any number of residents: John Kowalski, who had run the general store, or James Kramer, who had taught at the elementary school, or Jennifer Klein, who had worked as the town's volunteer librarian. Someone had taken the time to carve this message into concrete, someone who had wanted future visitors to know that the official story was not the whole truth. The inscription filled Sarah with the familiar excitement that came with discovering a crack in an official narrative. This was what she lived for, the moment when a routine story revealed depths that hadn't been visible from the surface. Someone in Millbrook Valley had wanted to leave a record, a message that contradicted the calm, orderly evacuation described in government reports. She photographed the inscription from multiple angles, using her phone's flashlight to illuminate the carved letters. As she worked, she became aware of how quiet the place was. Not just the absence of human noise, but a deeper silence that seemed to absorb sound. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing here, and the wind that had been rustling the trees along the access road died to nothing once she reached the heart of the abandoned town. Standing up from the foundation stone, Sarah surveyed the valley around her. The slopes that rose on either side were covered in mature forest that had reclaimed whatever fields and pastures had once existed here. But there was something odd about the pattern of growth. While most of the valley floor was choked with the kind of scrub vegetation that typically colonized abandoned areas, there were patches where nothing grew at all, bare spots of earth that looked sterile even after 50 years. Her phone showed 3 bars of signal, good enough to make calls if needed, but the GPS seemed confused about her exact location. The mapping application kept shifting between different coordinates, as if it couldn't quite decide where she was standing. She made a note to check this against her printed maps later, but added it to the growing list of small anomalies that seemed to surround this place. As the afternoon light began to fade, Sarah made her way back toward her car. She had planned to drive back to her hotel in Uniontown tonight, but something about the place made her reluctant to leave. The carved message had confirmed her suspicion that there was more to this story than environmental evacuation, but she needed more evidence, more sources, more pieces of the puzzle. Tomorrow, she would begin the systematic investigation that had made her career. She would track down government employees who had worked on the evacuation, environmental scientists who had studied the contamination, and anyone else who might have records or memories of what had really happened in Millbrook Valley 50 years ago. But tonight, driving away from the abandoned town with its cryptic warning carved in stone, Sarah Mitchell knew she had found the story that would define the next phase of her career. The truth about Millbrook Valley was waiting to be uncovered, hidden beneath 50 years of official silence and bureaucratic obfuscation. And if her instincts were right, that truth would prove to be far more disturbing than a simple chemical spill could ever explain. Part 2. Meet the searcher Sarah. Mitchell had built her reputation on the stories that others wouldn't touch, the investigations that required months of patient digging through archives and years of cultivating sources who preferred to remain nameless. Her corner office at the Washington Tribune was lined with filing cabinets containing the paper trails of 15 years of investigative work, each case representing dozens of interviews, hundreds of documents, and the kind of methodical research that had become increasingly rare in an age of 24-hour news cycles. The wall behind her desk displayed the evidence of her dedication: 3 Polk Awards, a Peabody for her series on defense contractor fraud, and a Pulitzer nomination for her investigation into pharmaceutical companies suppressing safety data. But these accolades represented more than professional achievement. They were proof that Sarah possessed something increasingly valuable in modern journalism: the patience to pursue stories that took years to develop and the credibility to convince sources to risk their careers by speaking truth to power. Her colleagues at the Tribune often joked that Sarah had been born without the gene for accepting official explanations. Where other reporters saw press releases and government statements as endpoints, Sarah saw them as starting points. She had learned early in her career that the most important stories were often hidden in the spaces between official accounts, in the documents that weren't released, in the phone calls that weren't returned, in the bureaucratic language that obscured rather than illuminated. The Millbrook Valley story had found her in the way that her best stories always did, through the peripheral vision of research into something else entirely. She had been investigating a series of industrial accidents in the 1970s for a feature about the evolution of environmental regulations when the single paragraph about the chemical spill evacuation had caught her attention. It wasn't what the paragraph said that intrigued her, but what it didn't say. The language was too clean, too devoid of the human details that typically accompanied such disasters. Sarah had developed a methodology over the years, a systematic approach to investigating stories that had been buried under layers of time and bureaucracy. She started with public records, mining databases and archives for every scrap of official documentation. Then she moved to contemporary news coverage, looking for patterns in what was reported and what was omitted. Finally, she began the most difficult part of the process, finding and interviewing people who had been there, who had witnessed events firsthand, and might be willing to share their memories decades later. The Millbrook Valley investigation had already consumed 3 weeks of her time, and she was just beginning to understand the scope of what she was uncovering. The initial research had revealed a pattern of gaps and inconsistencies that suggested the official story was at best incomplete, at worst deliberately fabricated. But Sarah had learned to trust her instincts about these patterns, and every instinct she possessed was telling her that Millbrook Valley represented something far more significant than a routine environmental disaster. The morning after her first visit to the abandoned town, Sarah spread her research materials across the large table in her hotel room in Uniontown. She had printed out every document she could find related to the 1974 evacuation, creating a timeline that revealed the first major inconsistency in the official narrative. According to the Department of Environmental Protection report, the chemical spill had occurred on the evening of October 14, 1974, and the evacuation had been completed by dawn on October 15th. But a weather report from the National Weather Service showed that a severe thunderstorm had struck the region on the night of October 14th, bringing high winds and heavy rain that would have made an organized evacuation extremely difficult. Emergency services records from surrounding counties showed no unusual activity that night, no requests for assistance with evacuation operations, no deployment of buses or emergency shelters. For a disaster that supposedly affected 200 people, the bureaucratic footprint was remarkably light. Sarah had also discovered that the Hastings Chemical Works, the facility that had allegedly caused the spill, had been closed for over a month before the supposed accident occurred. The company had filed for bankruptcy in September 1974, and its assets had been seized by creditors. The facility had been locked and sealed by federal marshals, making it impossible for any kind of industrial accident to have occurred there. In October, this revelation had led Sarah to the most disturbing discovery of her initial research. The evacuation of Millbrook Valley had been carried out not by local emergency services, but by personnel from the United States Army Chemical Corps, an organization typically deployed for military chemical warfare incidents, not civilian industrial accidents. The deployment orders were buried in Defense Department archives that Sarah had accessed through a Freedom of Information Act request, part of a routine dump of declassified documents that most journalists ignored. The Army Chemical Corps deployment had been authorized under something called Operation Safeguard, a classified program that Sarah had never heard of, despite her extensive knowledge of military operations from the 1970s. Her attempts to research Operation Safeguard had hit immediate roadblocks. The program was mentioned in several declassified documents, but always in heavily redacted passages that revealed nothing about its purpose or scope. Even the dates of the program's existence had been blacked out in most references. Sarah understood that she was entering territory that would require different methods than her usual investigative approach. Stories involving classified military operations demanded a level of caution and source protection that went beyond her normal practices. But she also recognized that this was exactly the kind of story that justified such precautions. If the United States Army had been involved in the disappearance of an entire civilian population, the implications extended far beyond a single Pennsylvania town. Her next step had been to contact Dr. Emily Chen, a researcher at Georgetown University, who specialized in the history of military medical experiments. Dr. Chen had served as a source for Sarah's previous investigations into pharmaceutical companies, and she possessed security clearances that allowed her access to classified archives that remained off-limits to journalists. More importantly, she shared Sarah's conviction that government secrecy often concealed activities that violated both legal and ethical standards. The conversation with Dr. Chen had taken place in a coffee shop near the Georgetown campus, a location chosen for its ambient noise and lack of surveillance cameras. Dr. Chen had listened to Sarah's preliminary findings with growing concern, occasionally asking questions about specific details or requesting clarification on dates and locations. Operation Safeguard was real, Dr. Chen had confirmed, speaking in the carefully modulated tone she used when discussing sensitive topics. It was part of a broader program of research into what they called population management techniques. The Army was interested in methods for controlling or relocating civilian populations in the event of various national security scenarios. Dr. Chen had paused to sip her coffee, her expression troubled. What you're describing sounds like it could have been a field test. The Army had theoretical frameworks for mass population relocation, but they needed to test whether their methods would work in practice. A small, isolated community would have been an ideal laboratory. The implications of this possibility had sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the October weather. If Millbrook Valley had been the site of a military experiment in population control, then the 200 residents hadn't been evacuated due to a chemical spill. They had been the subjects of a test designed to determine how effectively the government could make a civilian population disappear. But Dr. Chen had also provided Sarah with her first solid lead for finding surviving documentation. There was a whistleblower in the 1980s, she had explained. A former Army officer named Colonel Marcus Webb who tried to expose various Chemical Corps programs. He was court-martialed and discharged, but he had accumulated extensive documentation before his arrest. Some of that material was never recovered by the military. Colonel Webb had died in 1995, but Dr. Chen believed that his widow might still possess some of his files. Margaret Webb lived in a retirement community outside of Baltimore, and she had spent the decade since her husband's death fighting legal battles to prevent the government from seizing his remaining papers. Dr. Chen had provided Sarah with contact information, along with a warning about the risks involved in pursuing this line of investigation. Marcus Webb died under suspicious circumstances, Dr. Chen had said as they prepared to leave the coffee shop. Officially, it was a heart attack, but he was in excellent health and had been receiving death threats for years. If you decide to contact his widow, you need to understand that there are people who will do anything to keep this information buried. Sarah had thanked Dr. Chen and promised to take appropriate precautions, but she knew that she was already too deep into the story to turn back. The patterns she had uncovered pointed to something far more sinister than a simple cover-up of environmental negligence. If her suspicions were correct, Millbrook Valley represented evidence of illegal human experimentation on a scale that would dwarf previous scandals like MK Ultra or the Tuskegee experiments. The drive from Georgetown back to her hotel had given Sarah time to consider the implications of what she was uncovering. She had built her career on exposing corporate malfeasance and political corruption, but this story had the potential to reveal systematic violations of human rights by the United States military. The legal and ethical ramifications extended far beyond journalism, touching on fundamental questions about the relationship between government and citizens. But Sarah had also recognized an opportunity to do the kind of reporting that had drawn her to journalism in the first place. The residents of Millbrook Valley had disappeared without a trace, their fate unknown to family members and friends who might still be wondering what had happened to them. If they had been the victims of illegal government experimentation, then exposing that truth would serve not only the cause of historical accuracy, but also the cause of justice for people who had been powerless to defend themselves. That evening, Sarah had called Margaret Webb from her hotel room. The conversation had been brief and guarded, with Mrs. Webb clearly suspicious of Sarah's motives and concerned about the risks of discussing her late husband's work. But she had agreed to meet, recognizing that the passage of time had created an opportunity to reveal truths that had been too dangerous to discuss while the principals were still alive. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, but Sarah had decided to return to Millbrook Valley first. Her initial visit had focused on documenting the physical remains of the town, but she needed to conduct a more systematic search for evidence that might have been overlooked by whoever had been responsible for the cover-up. The carved message she had found suggested that at least one resident had tried to leave a record of what had really happened, and there might be other traces waiting to be discovered. As she prepared for her second visit to the abandoned town, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this point. She had spent 15 years building the reputation and skills necessary to investigate stories that challenged powerful institutions, but she had never tackled anything with the potential scope and implications of the Millbrook Valley case. The story had the potential to redefine her career, but it also carried risks that extended far beyond professional consequences. Still, as Sarah packed her equipment for another day of exploration among the ruins of the forgotten town, she felt the familiar excitement that came with pursuing a story that mattered. Somewhere in the overgrown foundations and abandoned buildings of Millbrook Valley lay the truth about what had happened to 200 American citizens 50 years ago. And Sarah Mitchell was determined to find it. Part 3. The Failed Official Response, Pennsylvania State Police Headquarters in Uniontown occupied a brick building that had seen better decades, its fluorescent-lit corridors echoing with the institutional efficiency of law enforcement bureaucracy. Sarah had arrived early for her appointment with Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, the current commander of the regional division, hoping to find official records that might shed light on the 1974 evacuation of Millbrook Valley. She had learned, over the years, that approaching law enforcement with specific questions and documented evidence often yielded better results than vague requests for information. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was a career officer in his late 50s, with the weathered face and cautious demeanor of someone who had spent decades navigating the intersection of public safety and political sensitivity. He received Sarah in his office, a cramped space dominated by filing cabinets and photographs of various police operations spanning several decades. The walls displayed the usual collection of commendations and certificates, but Sarah noticed that nothing dated back to the 1970s. "Ms. Mitchell," Harrison began, settling behind his desk with a thick folder that he kept closed throughout their conversation, "I understand you're researching the Millbrook Valley evacuation. I have to tell you up front that there's not much in our files about that incident. It was handled primarily by federal agencies, with state and local law enforcement providing only peripheral support." Sarah had expected this response, but she pressed for specifics. "What kind of peripheral support? Were state police involved in traffic control, crowd management, anything that would have generated incident reports or duty logs?" Harrison's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Sarah had conducted enough interviews to recognize the pause that preceded a carefully worded non-answer. "Our role was limited to maintaining perimeter security and ensuring that civilian traffic didn't interfere with the federal operation. Standard procedure for that type of emergency response. Do you have records of which officers were assigned to that operation? Duty rosters, overtime reports? Anything that would document their involvement?" "Personnel records from that era are archived differently than current files," Harrison replied, his tone becoming more formal. "Accessing them would require specific justification and approval from Harrisburg. It's not something we can do for routine media inquiries." Sarah had encountered this type of bureaucratic stonewalling before, but something about Harrison's manner suggested that he was not simply following standard protocols. His reluctance seemed personal, as if he had been specifically briefed on how to handle inquiries about Millbrook Valley. She decided to test this hypothesis by sharing some of the information she had already uncovered. Lieutenant Colonel, I've found documentation showing that the Army Chemical Corps was involved in the evacuation, operating under something called Operation Safeguard. Did state police coordinate with military personnel during the operation? Harrison's reaction confirmed Sarah's suspicion that this was not a routine records request. His expression tightened, and he glanced toward the closed door of his office as if ensuring their privacy. When he spoke again, his voice carried a warning tone that had been absent from their earlier exchange. Ms. Mitchell, I'm going to give you some advice that I hope you'll take seriously. Some stories are better left alone, especially stories involving federal operations from that era. There were a lot of programs in the 1970s that operated under different rules than what we have today. People who ask too many questions about those programs sometimes find themselves dealing with problems they didn't anticipate. Sarah recognized the warning for what it was, but she also heard something else in Harrison's voice that encouraged her to continue pressing. There was a note of reluctance, as if he was delivering a message that he didn't entirely support. She decided to take a calculated risk. Are you telling me this as an official representative of the Pennsylvania State Police, or as someone who knows more about what happened in Millbrook Valley than you're allowed to say? Harrison stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah could see him weighing competing loyalties and obligations. Finally, he stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the parking lot behind the building. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Off the record, and I mean completely off the record, you need to understand that some of us who were young officers back then have carried questions about that operation for 50 years. But asking those questions officially would have ended careers, maybe worse. The word came down from the top that Millbrook Valley was classified, and that classification hasn't been lifted. What word came down? From who? Harrison turned back toward her, but remained standing by the window. Federal agencies don't usually explain their decisions to local law enforcement. We were told that the evacuation was related to national security, that discussing it with unauthorized personnel would violate the Espionage Act. That's not the kind of threat that small-town police officers take lightly. Sarah felt the familiar thrill that came with discovering that an official cover-up was beginning to crack. Harrison's admission that state police had been warned off the story confirmed that there was indeed something to hide, something significant, enough that federal authorities had gone to considerable lengths to suppress local law enforcement curiosity. What did you see that night? You were there, weren't you? Harrison nodded slowly. I was a sergeant then, 26 years old and eager to please. They assigned me to checkpoint duty on Route 119, about 5 miles north of the town. My job was to stop any civilian traffic and redirect it away from the area. I was there from about 10 p.m. until dawn. What kind of traffic did you see? That's what bothered me then, and still bothers me now. I saw military vehicles going into the valley all night long. Trucks, personnel carriers, vehicles I didn't recognize. But I never saw any coming out with evacuees. For an evacuation of 200 people, there should have been buses, civilian vehicles, some kind of convoy carrying the displaced residents to emergency shelters. Harrison returned to his desk, but didn't sit down. Instead, he leaned against it, his posture suggesting that he was preparing to share information that he had kept secret for decades. Around 3 a.m, I saw something that didn't make sense. A convoy of military trucks coming out of the valley, moving fast and heading north toward the interstate. The trucks had canvas covers, so I couldn't see what they were carrying, but they were riding heavy. Whatever was in those trucks had weight to it. Did you report what you saw? I tried to. The next morning, I approached my lieutenant with questions about the evacuation procedure. He told me that my report should focus only on the civilian traffic that I had redirected, nothing else. When I pressed him about the military convoy, he said that federal operations were outside our jurisdiction and that discussing them would be inappropriate. Sarah made notes as Harrison spoke, but she was also studying his face. looking for signs that he was holding back additional information. The story he was telling painted a picture of local law enforcement being deliberately excluded from an operation that supposedly involved protecting civilian lives, which raised obvious questions about the true nature of that operation. Did you ever try to follow up, contact federal agencies, ask for clarification about what had happened to the evacuees? Harrison's laugh was bitter. You have to understand the political climate in 1974. This was just a few months after Nixon's resignation, after years of revelations about government surveillance and illegal activities. Local police officers who asked too many questions about federal operations were likely to find themselves under investigation for security violations or worse. But you kept wondering about it? For 50 years. And I wasn't the only one. There were maybe a dozen state and local officers involved in perimeter security that night, and over the years, a few of us would occasionally compare notes informally. None of us ever saw evidence of an actual evacuation. What we saw looked more like a military operation designed to move material out of the valley, not people. This was the most specific information Sarah had obtained about the events of October 14th, 1974, and it confirmed her growing suspicion that the official story was not just inaccurate, but deliberately fabricated. The image Harrison painted of heavy military trucks leaving the valley in the early morning hours suggested that something had been removed from Millbrook Valley, but the nature of that cargo remained unclear. Lieutenant Colonel, if you had to guess based on what you observed, what do you think really happened in Millbrook Valley? Harrison was quiet for a long time, staring at the folder on his desk that he had never opened during their conversation. When he finally answered, his voice carried the weight of 5 decades of unanswered questions. I think those people were taken somewhere. Not evacuated, taken. And I think whatever happened to them was serious enough that the federal government has spent 50 years making sure nobody asks too many questions about it. Have there been other inquiries over the years? Other journalists, researchers, family, members? A few. Back in the 1980s, there was a woman from Pittsburgh who came around asking questions. She claimed to be researching industrial accidents for some kind of academic project. She met with a couple of the officers who had been there. That night, asked them about their memories of the evacuation. What happened to her? She disappeared. Not officially, not in any way that would generate police reports or missing person investigations. But she stopped returning phone calls, stopped showing up for scheduled interviews. One of the officers tried to contact her at the university she claimed to be affiliated with, and they said they had no record of her ever being enrolled or employed there. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather outside Harrison's office. The pattern he was describing was consistent with systematic intimidation or elimination of people who got too close to the truth about Millbrook Valley. If her investigation had attracted similar attention, she might already be in danger without knowing it. What about family members of the missing residents? Surely some of them must have tried to find out what happened to their relatives. Harrison opened the folder for the first time during their conversation, revealing a stack of papers that looked like official correspondence. That's another thing that never made sense. In the months after the evacuation, we never received any missing person reports related to Millbrook Valley residents. No family members calling to ask about the whereabouts of evacuees. No inquiries about when people could return to their homes. That's impossible. 200 people don't just disappear without someone noticing. You would think so. But according to our records, and I've checked them multiple times over the years, there were no official inquiries about the fate of Millbrook Valley residents after the initial evacuation reports were filed. Sarah realized that this revelation might be the most disturbing aspect of the entire story. The absence of family inquiries suggested either that the residents of Millbrook Valley had been completely isolated from the outside world, or that their disappearance had been so thoroughly covered up that even their relatives had been convinced not to ask questions. Lieutenant Colonel, if someone wanted to investigate this story properly, what would you recommend? Harrison closed the folder and returned it to his desk drawer. the gesture clearly signaling that the official portion of their conversation was over. But he looked directly at Sarah as he answered, his expression conveying both warning and encouragement. Would recommend being very careful about who you trust and where you look for information. But I would also say that after 50 years, there might be people who are finally ready to tell the truth about what they saw. The question is whether you're prepared for what that truth might be. As Sarah left the state police headquarters, she understood that her investigation had moved into a new phase. The official response to Millbrook Valley had not been inadequate or incompetent. It had been deliberately suppressed by people who possessed both the authority and the motivation to keep the truth hidden. But that suppression had also created opportunities, as the passage of time had weakened the bonds of secrecy that had kept witnesses silent for 5 decades. Part 4. The first real lead, Margaret Webb, lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Sunset Manor, a retirement community nestled among the rolling hills outside Baltimore. The complex had the sterile cleanliness of institutional care, with wide hallways designed for wheelchairs and emergency lighting that cast harsh shadows across beige walls. Sarah had driven the 3 hours from Uniontown with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension, knowing that this conversation could either provide the breakthrough her investigation needed or confirm that the truth about Millbrook Valley had been buried too deeply to ever recover. Mrs. Webb answered her door with the cautious posture of someone who had spent decades looking over her shoulder. She was in her early 80s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that retained the sharp intelligence of someone who had spent her life married to a man fighting battles against powerful institutions. Her apartment was spartanly furnished, but the walls were covered with photographs spanning several decades of military service and family life. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, gesturing toward a small dining table near the window, "I hope you understand the risk I'm taking by talking to you. There are people who would prefer that my husband's work remain buried with him." Sarah had prepared for this meeting by researching Colonel Marcus Webb's military career and his subsequent legal troubles. Webb had served with distinction in Vietnam, earning multiple decorations for his work with the Army Chemical Corps in developing defensive measures against biological and chemical weapons. But his career had taken a dramatic turn in the early 1980s when he began questioning orders that he believed violated both military regulations and international law. "Mrs. Webb, I appreciate your willingness to meet with me. I know this isn't easy to discuss, but I believe your husband's documentation might be crucial to understanding what happened to the people of Millbrook Valley." Margaret Webb poured coffee from a thermal carafe, her movements precise despite her age. Marcus spent the last 15 years of his life trying to expose what he called the programs. He believed that the American people deserved to know what their government was doing, in their name, especially when it involved experimenting on civilians. She moved to a closet near the entrance and returned with a banker's box that looked like it had been packed and repacked multiple times over the years. The box was secured with multiple layers of tape, and Sarah could see that some of the sealing had been done recently. After Marcus died, federal agents came to the house within hours of the funeral. They had warrants to search for classified documents, but Marcus had anticipated that. He had hidden his most important files in places they would never think to look. Mrs. Webb began removing documents from the box, laying them out on the table, with the careful attention of someone who had organized and reorganized these materials many times. Sarah could see immediately that these were not photocopies or reconstructions, but original government documents with classification stamps and official letterheads. Operation Safeguard was one of several programs that Marcus was investigating when they forced him out of the Army, Mrs. Webb explained, pointing to a folder marked with classification levels that Sarah didn't recognize. The official purpose was to develop techniques for managing civilian populations during national emergencies. But the real purpose was much darker. Sarah examined the first document, a memorandum dated September 1974 that outlined the objectives of what it called Field Test Scenario 7. The language was deliberately obscure, filled with military jargon and euphemisms. But certain phrases jumped out at her. Complete population isolation, response measurement under controlled conditions, and post-extraction data analysis. Mrs. Webb, this memorandum is dated just 1 month before the Millbrook Valley evacuation. Do you think there's a connection? The elderly woman nodded grimly. Marcus was certain of it. He believed that Millbrook Valley was chosen as a test site because it was isolated, had a manageable population size, and could be contained without attracting significant outside attention. She pulled out another document, this one bearing the seal of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The title read, Psychological Effects of Induced Population Displacement, Preliminary Study Design. Sarah scanned the document quickly, her journalistic training allowing her to extract key information even from heavily technical language. The study design outlined a research protocol that was chilling in its clinical detachment. The researchers proposed to study how civilian populations would respond to sudden, unexplained relocation by actually subjecting a test population to such an experience. The document discussed the need for environmental isolation and controlled observation, conditions that would allow researchers to monitor subjects without their knowledge. According to this document, they wanted to study what they called adaptation patterns in displaced populations. They were interested in how people would respond to being cut off from their normal social networks and placed in unfamiliar environments. Mrs. Webb handed Sarah another file, this one containing what appeared to be personnel assignments and budget allocations for Operation Safeguard. The paperwork showed that the project had been allocated significant resources, including personnel, from multiple government agencies and funding that came from classified Defense Department accounts. The scope of this operation was enormous, Sarah observed, noting authorization signatures from officials in the Pentagon, the CIA, and agencies she didn't recognize. This wasn't a small-scale experiment. They were planning something that required coordination between multiple branches of government. Marcus used to say that the most frightening thing about these programs wasn't their scope, but their normality. The people involved weren't monsters or fanatics. They were career government, employees who had convinced themselves that they were serving national security interests. Mrs. Weber produced a document that made Sarah's breath catch. It was a list of locations that had been considered for field test implementation, and Millbrook Valley, Pennsylvania was highlighted with a handwritten notation, Approved Population. 203, Geographic Isolation Index 8.7, External Contact Minimization Feasible. Other locations on the list had been crossed out with notations explaining why they were unsuitable. Too close to media markets, insufficient isolation, population demographics problematic. Millbrook Valley had been selected not despite its remoteness and small population, but because of these characteristics. Mrs. Webb, this suggests that they were planning to do something to the residents that required complete secrecy. If it had been a legitimate evacuation, they wouldn't have needed this level of isolation. That's exactly what Marcus concluded. He believed that the residents of Millbrook Valley were transported to a facility where they could be studied under controlled conditions, like laboratory subjects. Sarah felt her investigative instincts sharpening as she processed this possibility. If the residents had been taken to a research facility rather than simply evacuated, then there might be records of where they were taken and what happened to them. But she also realized that such a facility would have required significant infrastructure and ongoing resources. Do you have any documentation about where they might have been taken? Research facilities, military installations, anywhere that could have housed 200 people for an extended period? Mrs. Webb consulted her organized files and pulled out a map of the northeastern United States, marked with various symbols and annotations in her husband's handwriting. Several locations were circled in red, with notes about their proximity to Millbrook Valley and their capacity for housing research subjects. Marcus identified 3 facilities that had the necessary infrastructure and security clearances to conduct this type of research. The closest was the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, about 150 miles from Millbrook Valley. The facility had been used for chemical and biological weapons testing since World War II. Sarah studied the map, noting that the marked facilities were all within a day's drive of the abandoned Pennsylvania town. The logistics of transporting 200 people to any of these locations would have been complex, but certainly feasible for an operation with military resources and planning. Did your husband ever try to investigate what happened at these facilities in 1974? He tried, but his access to classified information was revoked after he began asking too many questions. However, he did identify several researchers who worked on psychological studies during that period, people who might have direct knowledge of what happened to the Millbrook Valley residents. Mrs. Webb handed Sarah a list of names with academic, affiliations, and last known addresses. Most of the names were crossed out with dates that Sarah realized were death dates, but 3 names remained unmarked. Dr. Helena Vasquez was a behavioral psychologist who worked on several classified projects in the 1970s. According to Marcus's research, she published papers in the 1980s about population stress responses that seemed to be based on observational data rather than theoretical models. Sarah made careful notes about Dr. Vasquez and the other surviving researchers. These people would be in their 70s or 80s now if they were still alive, but they might represent her best chance of finding someone with direct knowledge of what had happened to the missing residents. Mrs. Webb, this documentation is extraordinary, but I have to ask about its authenticity. How can I verify that these documents are genuine? The elderly woman smiled for the first time during their conversation. Marcus anticipated that question. He had a contact at the National Security Archive who helped him verify the authenticity of several key documents. I have a letter from that contact confirming that the documents match the format and content of other classified materials from the same period. She produced a letter on George Washington University letterhead, signed by someone identifying themselves as a senior researcher at the National Security Archive. The letter didn't explicitly confirm the contents of the documents, but it did verify that they appeared to be authentic government materials based on formatting, classification markings, and internal references. Sarah realized that she was looking at evidence of what might be the most significant government cover-up in American history since Watergate. If these documents were authentic, they proved that the United States government had conducted illegal human experimentation on its own citizens, using military resources to abduct an entire community for research purposes. Mrs. Webb, why are you sharing this information with me now? You've kept these documents secret for decades. Margaret Webb was quiet for a moment, her gaze moving to a framed photograph on the wall showing a younger version of herself with a man in military uniform. Marcus made me promise that if the right person ever came asking the right questions, I would help them find the truth. He believed that the families of those missing people deserved to know what happened to their loved ones. She paused, her voice becoming more emotional. But more than that, he believed that if this story wasn't told, if these programs weren't exposed, then similar things could happen again. He used to say that governments only respect the rights of citizens when they know they're being watched. Sarah carefully packed photocopies of the most important documents into her own case. She understood that her investigation had crossed a threshold. She was no longer researching a historical mystery, but gathering evidence of crimes that might still be prosecutable if she could prove that any of the perpetrators were still alive. Mrs. Webb, I want you to know that I take the responsibility of this information very seriously. If I publish this story, I'll make sure that proper credit is given to your husband's courage in documenting these programs. The elderly woman walked Sarah to the door, her expression mixing hope and apprehension. Just remember that powerful people went to great lengths to bury this information once. They won't hesitate to do it again if they think their secrets are threatened. As Sarah drove back toward Pennsylvania with copies of Colonel Webb's documentation secured in her briefcase, she felt the weight of responsibility that came with possessing evidence of government crimes. The documents proved that Operation Safeguard had been real, that Millbrook Valley had been deliberately selected as a test site, and that the residence had been taken somewhere for purposes that violated every principle of human rights and constitutional law. But the documents also raised new questions that would require additional investigation. Where exactly had the residents been taken? What had happened to them during their captivity? Were any of them still alive? And who in the current government might still be protecting the secrets of Operation Safeguard? Sarah knew that answering these questions would require her to contact the surviving researchers identified in Colonel Webb's files, a step that would inevitably alert other people to her investigation. But she also knew that she had passed the point where retreat was possible. The truth about Millbrook Valley demanded to be told, regardless of the personal and professional risks involved. Part 5. The Dangerous Decision. Sarah sat in her hotel room in Baltimore, staring at the photocopied documents spread across the bed like pieces of a horrifying jigsaw puzzle. The evidence was compelling, even damning. But she knew that without living witnesses or additional corroboration, even the most damning government documents could be dismissed as elaborate forgeries or taken out of context. She needed to find Dr. Helena Vasquez, the behavioral psychologist whose name had appeared repeatedly in Colonel Webb's files as someone who had direct involvement with Operation Safeguard. According to the research notes Mrs. Webb had provided, Dr. Vasquez had worked for the Defense Department's Psychological Warfare Division in the 1970s, before transitioning to academic research in the 1980s. Her published papers from that later period included studies on population stress response patterns and behavioral adaptation in controlled environments that seemed to describe real observational data rather than theoretical models. Sarah's internet research had revealed that Dr. Vasquez, now 78 years old, was living in an assisted living facility outside of Richmond, Virginia. The facility's website described it as a high-end community for retired professionals, the kind of place where former government employees might spend their final years surrounded by others who understood the weight of classified secrets. The drive to Richmond took Sarah through the heart of Virginia's government corridor, past exits for Quantico, Fort Belvoir, and the Pentagon. This was the geographic center of America's national security apparatus, where decisions made in windowless conference rooms could determine the fate of entire communities. As she drove, Sarah couldn't help but wonder how many other Millbrook Valleys existed in classified files, how many other experiments had been conducted on unsuspecting American citizens. Willowbrook Manor occupied a sprawling campus of colonial-style buildings surrounded by manicured lawns and walking paths. The security was subtle but thorough, with keycard access points and cameras positioned at regular intervals. Sarah had called ahead to schedule a meeting with Dr. Vasquez, identifying herself as a freelance researcher working on a book about Cold War psychology programs. She had deliberately avoided mentioning Millbrook Valley or Operation Safeguard, hoping to gauge the elderly psychologist's reactions when those topics came up naturally in conversation. Dr. Helena Vasquez received Sarah in the facility's library, a quiet room lined with leather-bound books and furnished with comfortable chairs that encouraged lengthy conversations. Despite her age, Dr. Vasquez retained the sharp-eyed alertness of someone accustomed to analyzing human behavior. She was dressed conservatively in a navy blue sweater and slacks, her silver hair pulled back in a style that suggested decades of professional meetings and academic conferences. "Ms. Mitchell," Dr. Vasquez said, settling into a chair across from Sarah, "I understand you're researching psychological programs from the 1970s. It's not often that someone shows interest in that period of my career." Sarah had prepared carefully for this conversation, knowing that she would need to build trust gradually before introducing the most sensitive topics. "Dr. Vasquez, I'm particularly interested in the intersection between academic psychology and government research during the Cold War. Your published work from the 1980s suggests that you had access to unusually detailed observational data." Dr. Vasquez's expression remained neutral, but Sarah noticed a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested the comment had struck home. Academic research in that era often benefited from government funding and resources, The boundary between theoretical study and practical application was sometimes blurred. Your 1983 paper on behavioral adaptation patterns described what seemed like real-time observations of populations under stress. The level of detail suggested access to controlled environments where subjects could be monitored over extended periods. Ms. Mitchell, I think you should be more direct about what you're really researching. Your questions suggest that you're interested in specific programs rather than general academic history. Sarah recognized that Dr. Vasquez was too experienced to be drawn into revealing sensitive information through indirect questioning. She decided to take the calculated risk of revealing some of what she already knew, hoping that the psychologist's reaction would confirm or contradict her suspicions. I'm investigating what happened to the residents of Millbrook Valley, Pennsylvania in 1974. I have documentation suggesting that their disappearance was connected to a program called Operation Safeguard, and that you were involved in studying the psychological effects of their relocation. Dr. Vasquez was silent for nearly a minute, her gaze moving to the windows that overlooked the facility's gardens. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of secrets that had been carried for nearly 50 years. Operation Safeguard was classified at levels that still exist today. Discussing it could result in criminal prosecution under the Espionage Act, even for someone my age living in a retirement facility. Dr. Vasquez, the people involved in authorizing that program are either dead or beyond prosecution. But the families of the Millbrook Valley residents deserve to know what happened to their loved ones. You have the power to provide that closure. You don't understand what you're asking, Dr. Vasquez replied, but her tone suggested internal conflict rather than outright refusal. The people who authorized Operation Safeguard weren't monsters. They genuinely believed they were protecting national security interests. The Cold War created an environment where normal ethical constraints were suspended in the name of defending democracy. Sarah leaned forward, sensing that the psychologist was struggling with competing loyalties and moral obligations. What happened to the 200 people who were taken from Millbrook Valley? Are any of them still alive? Dr. Vasquez stood up and walked to the window, her back to Sarah as she considered her response. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the library, and Sarah could hear the distant sounds of other residents going about their daily routines in the peaceful facility. The Millbrook Valley subjects were transported to a research facility in West Virginia, Dr. Vasquez said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The facility was designed to study how isolated populations adapt to controlled environments over extended periods. It was supposed to help us understand how American communities might respond to occupation or displacement during wartime. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as Dr. Vasquez confirmed what the documents had suggested. How long were they kept at this facility? The original study design called for a 6-month observation period. The subjects were housed in a simulated community environment, with researchers monitoring their behavioral adaptations, social dynamics, and psychological responses to isolation. But something went wrong. Dr. Vasquez turned back toward Sarah, her expression reflecting decades of guilt and regret. The subjects began developing severe psychological symptoms much earlier than anticipated. Depression, anxiety, paranoia, and in some cases, complete psychological breakdown. The isolation and uncertainty were more traumatic than the research models had predicted. What did you do when you realized the subjects were being harmed? I submitted reports recommending that the study be terminated and the subjects returned to their families, but the program administrators argued that premature termination would invalidate the research and waste the significant resources that had been invested. Sarah realized that she was hearing a confession that could potentially result in criminal charges if the statute of limitations hadn't expired. Dr. Vasquez was admitting to participation in what amounted to kidnapping and illegal human experimentation on a massive scale. Dr. Vasquez, how long were the Millbrook Valley residents actually kept at the facility? The elderly psychologist returned to her chair, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. 18 months. Some subjects were released, earlier due to severe psychological deterioration, but most were held for the full duration of the extended study period. Released where? Were they returned to their families? That's where the program crossed lines that should never have been crossed. The subjects who were released were relocated to different parts of the country under new identities. They were told that their former lives no longer existed, that returning to their original communities would pose security risks that couldn't be tolerated. Sarah felt a combination of horror and vindication as she processed this information. The residents of Millbrook Valley hadn't simply been evacuated or even kidnapped for research purposes. They had been systematically stripped of their identities and scattered across the country to prevent them from revealing what had been done to them. What about the subjects who weren't released? You said some were held for the full 18 months. Dr. Vasquez's composure finally cracked, and tears began running down her cheeks as she struggled to answer. Some subjects never recovered from the psychological trauma. They were transferred to long-term psychiatric facilities under false identities, diagnosed with conditions that would justify indefinite commitment. Are any of them still alive? I don't know. After I submitted my final report condemning the program, I was reassigned to other projects and denied access to follow-up information. But some of those people would be in their 70s and 80s now, if they survived decades of institutional care. Sarah understood that she had uncovered evidence of crimes that extended far beyond the original kidnapping of the Millbrook Valley residents. The systematic destruction of their identities and the long-term psychiatric commitment of traumatized subjects represented violations of human rights on a scale that demanded justice, even 50 years after the fact. Dr. Vasquez, I need to know the location of the research facility where they were held. If any of the subjects are still alive, they deserve to be found and reunited with their families. The facility was called the Blackwood Research Station. It was located in the mountains of West Virginia, about 40 miles southeast of Charleston. But I don't know if the facility still exists or if any records have been preserved. Sarah made careful notes about the location while considering her next steps. Finding the Blackwood Research Station would require significant resources and potentially dangerous fieldwork, but it represented her best chance of finding physical evidence of what had happened to the Millbrook Valley residents. Dr. Vasquez, why are you telling me this now? You've kept these secrets for 50 years. The psychologist wiped her eyes with a tissue, her voice becoming stronger as she spoke. Because I've spent 50 years living with the knowledge that I participated in destroying the lives of innocent people. I told myself that I was following orders, that I was serving national security interests, but the truth is that I was complicit in crimes against humanity. She paused, looking directly at Sarah with an expression of desperate hope. If there's any chance that some of those people are still alive, if there's any possibility of giving them back their identities and reconnecting them with their families, then I owe it to them to help make that happen. As Sarah prepared to leave Willowbrook Manor, she realized that her investigation had reached a critical juncture. She now possessed detailed testimony from a direct participant in Operation Safeguard, along with documentation that corroborated the most disturbing elements of the story. But she also understood that pursuing the truth would require her to locate and potentially infiltrate a classified research facility in the mountains of West Virginia, a task that would test every skill she had developed as an investigative journalist. The drive back to her hotel gave Sarah time to consider the full implications of what Dr. Vasquez had revealed. If even a few of the Millbrook Valley residents were still alive in psychiatric facilities, finding them would require accessing medical records and patient files that were protected by multiple layers of legal and bureaucratic barriers. But the alternative was allowing innocent people to live out their final years without ever knowing their true identities or reconnecting with families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to them. That evening, Sarah called her editor at the Washington Tribune to discuss the story she was developing. She couldn't reveal all the details over an unsecured phone line, but she needed to ensure that her newspaper would support the resources and legal protection that the investigation would require. This story has the potential to be one of the most significant exposés of government misconduct in decades, she told her editor. But pursuing it will require travel, legal research, and possibly confronting federal agencies that have spent 50 years covering up what happened. Her editor's response was immediate and unequivocal. Sarah, if you can document government involvement in kidnapping and human experimentation, then we'll provide whatever resources you need. This is exactly the kind of story that justifies our existence as a newspaper. As Sarah hung up the phone, she understood that she had crossed the point of no return in her investigation. Tomorrow, she would begin the journey to West Virginia and the search for the Blackwood Research Station, knowing that she was pursuing a truth that powerful people had killed to protect. But she also knew that the residents of Millbrook Valley and their families deserved nothing less than the complete truth about what had happened 50 years ago. The next phase of her investigation would test her courage, her skills, and possibly her survival. But Sarah Mitchell had built her career on pursuing stories that others were afraid to tell, and she wasn't about to stop now when she was this close to exposing one of the darkest secrets in American government history. If this story has gripped you as much as it has me, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more shocking investigations into the hidden truths that powerful people don't want you to know. Hit that notification bell, because next week we'll follow Sarah into the mountains of West Virginia as she searches for the Blackwood Research Station and the survivors who may still be trapped there after 50 years of captivity.